Hi, Bob.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Nice to have you here today.
Thank you.
So, today my guest is Bob Fuhrer. He's co-founder and president of AMPL Optimization and professor emeritus of industrial engineering and management sciences at Northwestern University. In collaboration with colleagues at Bell Laboratories, he initiated the design and development of AMPL, a widely used optimization language and system. He has also been a contributor to the news server and other efforts to make optimization services available over the internet. He shared the Beale-Orchard-Hays Prize for the news and the Informs Impact Prize in recognition of the influence of algebraic modeling languages for optimization. Bob contributed to the advancement of the simplex algorithm by introducing extensions to allow for the objective to be convex, separable, piecewise-linear. And he has also tackled the resolution of indefinite linear systems found in interior point methods. In 2004, he was elected Fellow of Informs. Bob, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. It's a huge honor to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Okay. Bob, I know you have studied at MIT and Stanford, but when and where did your life begin in the US?
So I was born in Philadelphia, which is where my parents are from. I lived there till I was 12. My father worked in a refinery as a chemical engineer. Of course, refining was one of the early applications of optimization, but
Yeah, you were from 1950, right?
yes. So my father worked in that, and by the time we left, I had three younger siblings. So my mother had her hands full at that time.
Yeah.
And,
So your father was a chemical engineer that worked for oil company. But what about your mom?
well, she studied biology in college, but it wasn't until long after when we had moved that she started actually working in medical labs. Like I said, she had her hands full with all these children. So they both went to the University of Pennsylvania. So they were, in Philadelphia. So
Are any of your siblings scholars like you?
oh no, one was an airline pilot, and one's a freelance electrical engineer, did all sorts of projects, and another one did a number of things. He eventually just started his own business in Chicago, doing like different kinds of landscaping and construction and so forth that people need in a place that has lots and lots of old buildings.
I see. So there's a variety there
Yeah.
among the siblings. It seems that you have revealed an early talent for mathematics while still in Philadelphia, right?
Yeah. Yes, even while I was there, I found the math courses to be unchallenging. And I must have complained to my parents because somehow they arranged for three of us in that school to be sort of taken out and do our own studies at a faster level. So that was the first I remember of being different that way.
Uh-huh. So you took advanced classes in school.
Well, it wasn't really an advanced class because there were only three. Like they just sort of gave us some things to do, and someone supervised us a little. I don't know if you're good at math, then you don't need as much supervision. You're more pushing to do more things rather than asking the teacher all the time, "Oh, I don't get this." So
Yeah, I got it. What was the impact in your life when you moved to New Jersey?
so my father got moved to the head office in New York. So we moved to the New Jersey suburbs of New York, and the main effect was that when I was 12 or so within a few years, I was going into the city a lot. So that was the city that sort of had the really big impact on me and where I spent a lot of time.
So you went to movies and museums and,
Right. And so that's right. There were that was back when you have to go into New York to see a foreign movie, So I did a lot of that, and also libraries. Since my dad worked in New York City, I could borrow his library card and do research for high school papers. Or there's a whole library devoted to music, and you can take out like scores of different musical pieces, and I could read along and see what they were actually playing. So and of course I spent a lot of time on subways and just staying around New York is really big.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned you went to the library. What did you like to read in those days, other than original scores?
I don't know. I would read anything. I mean, read a lot of novels and such, and books about science and so forth. But I don't have a recollection of having like a kind of book that really got me excited so much. It's just, well, if something looked interesting, I would read it. So,
Right.
so
So I can see that you have a musical interest.
yeah, I also like played clarinet in the high school band, but I had a musical interest, but it wasn't. I didn't have any great musical talent, so it wasn't something I followed up that much. Because, I mean, in a high school band, they have use for lots of third clarinets, you know. But like,
And then what did you like to listen to in those days?
let's see. So my parents listened to a combination of classical music and what was popular in their day, you know, when they were young, and so that's probably much what I started out listening to. But of course, when I mean, my high school days coincided with, you know, the Beatles and so forth. So there's a certain influence from that too, which only increased with the years as I got to know more kinds of music.
Did you grow a long hair and?
Well, now I was in high school, I think that would have that would have disturbed people a lot. And, only when I got to college, and that was more because like I didn't like getting my hair cut, so it was too much trouble, right? So
Yeah. Did you find high school exciting or boring?
let's see, high school specifically, I mean, was not too exciting, I'd say, especially the like math and science, where they didn't really have inspiring teachers as they had in things like the English and history, and our physics teacher didn't really know calculus, and like, so that was sort of boring. I can say that I couldn't wait to get out of high school. And,
Okay.
But life itself wasn't boring. I mean, there were lots of exciting things going on, and things to do, and so forth.
Yeah. At some point, you started attending classes at Columbia University.
Yeah.
And how did that work?
So yeah, this is actually part of a general sort of theme. So I was now living in a new place, and so the problem came up all over again. Well, what can I do that's interesting? That's like not so elementary as high school. And my parents found that there was a program for high school students at Columbia that had classes on Saturdays that were specially for high school students. These were not, we weren't taking college classes, and this was math and computers and also like biology and other scientific fields. So it was not specifically just because I was good at math. And every semester you could pick from some list of things you wanted to take, and then you go in every Saturday. I have to take a bus down to somewhere and across the bridge to Manhattan, and then it's subway down to Columbia. And that was one thing I did. And then in addition to this Columbia thing with Saturdays, in my summer after my sophomore year, there was a daily class on programming specifically. So I had seen programming before in the Saturday classes, but this was the first opportunity I had to really program every day and get results back and look at them and so forth. And then also there were other summer programs. So after the next summer, there were programs funded by the National Science Foundation, and I chose one that was specifically on math. And this is actually the fairly notable, what's called the Ross program at Ohio State University. And it was actually an 8-week program. So this was the first time I actually went off to a college. So I went to Columbus, and I went, you know, they gathered together all these high school students who were enthusiastic about math, and they taught you all these classes, and it was designed so that you could come back the next year and take different classes. And some people actually came back later as counselors, and so it was a whole scene there. And back in those days too, you could sort of live like a college student, and nobody paid too much attention to exactly where you were or when you got to bed, or whether you turned on some lights and started playing basketball at 11:30 at night or whatever, and or got up at 6 in the morning and went out for donuts. You could just do what you wanted. And so it was really my first taste of, besides of like a lot of math and doing tons of proofs and trying more advanced things, it was also a taste of just sort of being in college.
Right. So this sounded definitely much more exciting than going to high school.
Yeah. It was quite different. And and then also my high school did have an independent study program. So if you felt that you wanted to do something special, you could get permission to take off from a class that you were taking for a whole semester and do something special. So my last 2 years, I sort of took this high school math course for the first half of the year, and then got this independent study set up and did something more advanced by myself. And now, normally you were supposed to have like a teacher who was working with you on all this stuff, but in my case, I can't remember that anybody ever asked me what it was that I was doing. And my theory is that they were afraid I would tell them, and who knows what math I was doing, right? So the second year, I took calculus for the first half of the year, and then in December I got early admission to MIT. So I was already in college, right? So I wrote to them and asked them for their calculus books, and I said I have to do an independent study to teach myself MIT calculus, so I don't have to take it when I get there. So that was another example of sort of trying to do something special.
Did you get any scholarship at MIT?
I had a little one. There was something called a National Merit Scholarship, and my father's company sponsored one. So I got a little scholarship money. But colleges were not nearly as expensive then as they are now. Even taking inflation into account, it was not so bad.
When you joined MIT, you got exempted from many courses, right?
Yes, but I don't know. I sort of overdid it probably. I was always trying to get out of something or other, and sometimes with more justification than other times. And but I didn't have to take calculus. And then my advisor, I was a math major, so my advisor gave me some advice. He said, "Don't take differential equations; it's a real drag." And so I never took differential equations. And then since I was a math major, I never took linear algebra either, although I ended up teaching it because math majors took abstract algebra. And then I talked to the professor teaching abstract algebra and managed to talk myself out of having to take the first semester of that. He asked me to prove some crazy thing like, a ring modulo a maximal ideal is a field or something like this. And I was able to prove it off the top of my head. But I should tell you that at the same time I was there was another student from Ohio State who was talking his way out of the second semester of abstract algebra. So that wasn't all that unusual. Okay. And I knew people were better at math than I was. So.
And how about OR classes?
And I never heard of anything called OR while I was an undergraduate. And all I did was I finished up my math stuff and took all sorts of abstract math kinds of courses. And my other big activity was I started working on the campus newspaper. And
why?
And the story there is that they had some sort of activity fair where you could go to see what all the activities were. And somehow I gathered from the newspaper's booth there that if you wrote movie reviews for the campus newspaper, you could get free entry to movies. And I thought, well, that was a great thing. And it turned out it worked for plays as well. So I started writing there, which is great. It was good practice writing, actually. And you would come together twice a week to put together the paper, and they'd order a lot of pizza and people would sit around. And that was also just when it became possible to actually produce your own newspaper and just take it to a printer and say, print it. And it used to be you'd send off the copy to a printer and they'd have somebody set it and type and all this. Well, you could do that yourself. And so they bought all this equipment and then they needed volunteers to run it. So I spent a lot of late nights just typing things into these machines and running them off, and which is also a great way to learn how to type really fast.
Did you have the chance to interview any famous person?
So the story is that when the movie Putney Swope came along, which was my freshman or sophomore year, I don't know, me and somebody else were asked to interview the director, who was Robert Downey Sr. Because Robert Downey Jr. is quite famous and just won an Oscar, right? But his father actually made these sort of semi-underground movies, and I had seen one in high school, and so we actually got to ask him about things, how it was made, and whether they actually had a script and things like that.
Yeah, it should have been really exciting. You really got yourself involved in the newspaper activities, and later you even worked for a commercial journal called Boston Phoenix.
Right. it just happened by accident. Somebody had inherited some money and decided to start a newspaper. Remember, I said anybody could start a newspaper now. The only problem is he doesn't have money for so much production equipment, and so he couldn't produce headlines. So he came to us at MIT. I was sort of doing odd jobs around the newspaper production in the summer to make some money, and said, "Well, I need somebody to typeset the headlines," and so we started doing that, and we ended up typesetting the whole paper. And then he ran out of money and sold it to somebody who was more commercially oriented. And when the summer was over, the MIT newspaper needed the material, the production equipment back. So they bought their own, and they set it up they set it up on the second floor above a nightclub or sort of a music venue that the owner actually also owned. And there I had I had a great job for my junior year every weekend producing this paper. And it covered all my expenses, and it was exciting because that year that paper really took off, and every week the sales were up, and they printed a lot of interesting articles, and so it was great to be a part of it.
Yeah, very unusual. Since you were, doing math major, and suddenly you were all involved in this newspaper business. Yeah. And since you're talking about newspapers, did you attempt to solve the newsvendor problem at any point?
Well, actually, I observed other people attempting to solve the newsvendor problem, because this paper, one of the ways that they built their popularity was by offering to sell anybody as many papers as they wanted for 5 cents each, and they could then turn around and resell them for 25 cents. And so they obviously had to decide what the optimal number of newspapers to buy might be. And from what I could judge, it was a very large number, like hundreds of them. People would have giant stacks on Tuesdays when it came out. And so I did think a bit about, like, how did they decide this? And that was one of my first interactions with an OR problem. Also, we had OR problems in just producing the paper. So my job, I wasn't a writer for the paper. My job was to make sure that all the pages got pasted up, and to coordinate between the person who was laying out the pages and the people who were typesetting the pages on this special paper that was like cut up and pasted on. And so we found various ways that if you were careful about how you did it, the whole thing would be sped up. You didn't typeset things in random order. You picked a special order and things like that. And that was a really also OR stuff.
Yeah, it looks like solving a puzzle. At the end of the day. Bob, eventually you returned to the MIT newspaper, but this time as editor-in-chief.
That's right. So just by accident, I ran across one of my fellow contributors to the MIT paper. We were walking in opposite directions across the street, and the signal changed very frequently, so we couldn't discuss anything. So we quickly made plans to have lunch, and at lunch we decided we would try to take over the campus newspaper because we weren't working for it at the time. I had this other job with the Phoenix, and so we've hatched a plot to sort of nominate me for this and do a bunch of things to show what we had in mind, and so it turned out in the spring they were electing somebody for the following fall, right? So at the end of the spring term there was this contested election. I won this election, so I was there's basically a board of directors, and they were all voting on this, and so I won the vote eventually, and that meant that I had to sort of, I did the Phoenix for a certain amount over the summer, but then I resigned because I had this other job, and I thought there was only so far I could get doing makeup, although I had ended up being also the layout editor by the time I left.
Wow. Did you get any credits? Because it sounds like a lot of work being editor-in-chief of a newspaper.
Yeah, that was one part of our scheme was that there was somebody, I think he was a friend of the president of the university, actually, who had been a journalist for many years and was now sort of a special professor. And we went to him and convinced him that it would be great to have a course for people involved in journalism on campus. And so that gave us a course we could take that where mostly what we did for that course was to produce the newspaper, which is what we were planning to do all along.
That's great. Bob, at that time, a lot of demonstrations related to civil rights movements and also to the Vietnam War were going on. Also around the time in the 1970, there was the Great Student Strike.
Yeah.
What was your impression, and did you take part of the protests?
Uh, well, I didn't do too much in the way of protests, except there were huge protests where, like, 100,000 people would converge on Boston Common, or there was a huge march on Washington or something, and I was involved in some of those things, just as a participant, just showing up. And I remember the student strike very well. That was the end of my sophomore year, so I was working on the campus newspaper, and even the editors of our newspaper at that time, who were pretty conservative. I mean, MIT in general was pretty conservative, and these newspapers, the editors at that time were, called for this student strike, and so it was all because of Vietnam War, and all sorts of things happened which are well known, and that led to all the classes being canceled then, and which is hard to imagine, but they were all canceled early, and everybody just got a passing grade, and we put out special issues of the newspapers, this and so forth. So it was maybe an exciting time, but I was not a principal in this, partly because I worked for newspapers, so like I wasn't thinking in terms of, I should go out and start these protests. It's more I should like cover them or see what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of material at a time for you.
Yeah.
By the way, did you attend Woodstock?
Oh, yeah. I lived in the Northeastern New Jersey, so it was actually a local event. I mean, you could just drive an hour up, and it was there. So I went down to my parents' place and borrowed a car and drove up to Woodstock for a day. By the second day, my things were completely soaked, and the car's battery had failed. So I ended up coming back early because I was in pretty bad shape. But,
okay. But did you go there and...
I was there for the first day, and...
okay. But did you go there and walk through the mud and, did all those crazy things?
I must have walked through some mud because I was pretty soaked. And I slept there. I slept the night just out in front of the stage because, what happened there was you would drive up and think, well, eventually I'm going to get to somewhere where they're going to ask me if I have a ticket. And I'll say, can I buy a ticket? Right. But what actually happened was that, well, it was just clogged with cars. So eventually you just had to park by the side of the road and walk. And then you walked and you walked and you walked. And at some point you realized that you were in, and they'd given up on actually selling tickets or even checking tickets. So then you could do whatever you wanted.
So you slept near the stage?
Yeah. Well, you were sitting there on this hill, the stage was at the bottom there, and like there was nowhere to go. So it wasn't exactly really well planned. So that was like the big music event of the summer. And I know a little about it.
Yeah. Pretty wild, I would say.
Yeah.
What was your plan after obtaining your math major in 1971?
Gee, did I have a plan? I don't know. Well, anyway, I looked for some newspaper jobs at first because that's what I've been doing. But the golden age of newspapers was sort of past by then, and you had to really be determined to get a newspaper job to stick it out, So then I looked for jobs that involved writing and technical stuff, or writing and computing or writing and math and such. And I found a job like that for a while, and from somebody there I heard about a better job that was opening up in a research center that was affiliated with MIT. And it turned out that it was really a statistics center, but they had hired this expert to write them a linear programming system because they thought they should get into linear programming. And the problem was that none of their writing staff knew anything about linear programming, and they didn't know where to find anybody who knew anything about linear programming. So they figured, well, at least I was a math major, I could read up on it. And I had never heard of it. That's the first time I heard of it. And the person they had hired was Beale-Orchard-Hays, who was one of the pioneers in implementing these systems.
Yeah, and then you got the prize named after him later.
Yes,
this is crazy.
Yeah, much later, I shared a prize that was named after him.
Mm-hmm. That research center became the National Bureau of Economics later.
Yeah, actually there had long been something called the National Bureau of Economic Research
Uh-huh.
They were famous for deciding when a recession had occurred.
Okay.
And but uh, the head of it at that time decided that they should get more into computational research. So he set up an affiliated research center. This is the one at MIT, which is like the computational research center of the National Bureau of Economic Research. And they sort of developed or continued to develop one of the first interactive statistical systems. And that's where they hired Orchard-Hays and where I ended up. And,
Yeah, so you were a technical writer
yeah,
there?
so I was, but actually they offered me the technical writer job and I turned it down. And when they asked me why, they said, well, do you need more money? And I said, well, I could use a little more money, but what I really wanted was to do something else other than write technical writing. Because I found that if you had the label technical writer, then people forgot that you had a math degree. And they didn't ask you to do anything interesting except like write the stuff up. And they didn't even notice when you did the math. But this was more of an academic research center, so they were happy to entertain this. And so they wrote me up a new offer that said, well, yes, you can do all these other things. So I did testing, and I did one little project for another local research center that involved building an optimization model, and I wrote a paper with my colleague Michael Harrison on what linear programming systems should really be like, and got to do lots of things, and that sort of got me interested in studying it.
Wow. So initially you were supposed to be a technical writer, but things evolved and after a while you were coding and developing linear programming systems and documenting them. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, while I was there, I didn't code anything.
Oh, okay.
Okay. In fact, all their code was in like machine language, and they had two programmers to do nothing but take care of it. But I learned how it worked. I mean, Orchard-Hays had this book that told you exactly how they build all these things, and I learned how it worked, which is really useful because the way it was taught was completely different. And I learned quite a bit about it, and I learned about applying it, about modeling how the systems were designed, and so forth. But
I see.
But I wasn't actually a programmer there. And this was all expected. I think the moral of it is that like you should set expectations before you take the job, because that'll determine what you can do afterwards.
Got it. So when did you realize you were ready for doing a PhD?
Well, I was there about 2 years, so I don't know, probably by the end of the first year, I could see that if you really wanted to do this, you needed a PhD so that then you could be at least in a research center and be one of the researchers. I mean, I got to do lots of things, but I was never going to be a researcher there with only a bachelor's degree in math. So, and then also I had found something that was really interesting to me, so it was worth getting a PhD in it. And when I got out of college, I mean, I had a math degree, but I didn't really know of anything I wanted to study.
And I mean, you were out of college for 5 years now. And how was the process of applying to several universities? And did you look for, mentorship or something like that?
Yeah, that was pretty straightforward. I did talk to Tom McNanty at MIT, who was a young professor back in those days, and I had sat in on one of his courses, and so I went to him and said, which graduate schools would you recommend? And his PhD was from Stanford, which is where I ended up. And then applying was easy enough, and it turned out to not be very nerve-wracking to get into graduate school.
Okay, so you basically applied to Stanford, and that's it.
And I applied to maybe 5 schools, but the problem was not getting an acceptance at the schools. I mean, really what you want was financially, but even that you could get pretty much where, I mean, if you were an American student who already had a background in this stuff, in some sort of OR thing, then you are a pretty relatively scarce commodity.
Okay.
Even back then, it's even more so now. So I had wondered, would they prefer people who just got out of undergraduate and were, fresh? But no, it turned out that like universities, graduate programs like people who've been out for a while, because now they know why they're going back, right? I mean, they're not just going on to graduate school because they don't know anything else to do. And so actually that was easy enough. I mean, it was, the application was there. The main problem was I had to choose one of them. And by then my father's company had moved out to California. My parents lived in California. I had brothers who lived in California. I knew other people who had gone to Stanford. I had some friends from Cambridge who had moved out to the West Coast, and so it was easy to decide to go somewhere there.
So
And
off you went to California from the east to the west coast, and you did your PhD with George Dantzig.
Yeah.
How was the experience of working with him, and what do you have to say about him in general?
Well, I can't say too much about the experience. He basically gave me an idea and let me run with it. And so I would occasionally show him drafts of things I had written, and because of all that writing, it didn't seem particularly exceptional to me to actually write the dissertation, because I had to do all this, had experience writing, and so. But his great talent was not only as a researcher, but as someone who brought together lots of researchers to collaborate with. And so there was a great group there that he had who were actually doing a lot of computational optimization, which was really what interested me. So I'd say that was really my experience working with him, was sort of being part of that whole group. And
so he was a great leader and knew how to bring people together.
Yes. And of course, he had to raise funds to support all this and so forth. And on top of that, he was one of the contributors to a number of big ideas.
So what was the topic of your PhD?
So my PhD was on solving what are called staircase structured linear programs, which are basically the structure that you find in ones that are staged. A series of times that are connected one to the next is the most common, but there are other structural ones where it's a series of structures connected one to the next, or anything like that. And the idea was, could you go through an implementation of the simplex method and see all the different places where it could be specialized to take advantage of that structure? So fortunately, they had this code called Minos there that was written in Fortran by Murtaugh and Saunders, and that was available, and reasonably well commented, and so I could go in there and just change anything I wanted to change, and to do all this, and that's basically what my dissertation involved. Of course, first I had to figure out what all these techniques were that they were using in there, and track down all the papers and figure out what was going on, and then try different things, see what worked, and so that fit pretty much into my interest in sort of computational optimization, I'd say, and Michael Saunders became one of the members of my committee.
Wow. You worked really on your own, essentially, right? You were very independent.
Yeah, Michael, unfortunately, that was the year that Michael had a sabbatical in New Zealand. He went back to New Zealand for a year. And in those days, you didn't just send him an email. And so it's like every now and then, people from this group would send him a letter, and he'd get back some letters saying, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." So it really helped if you could be sort of independent.
Yeah, you pretty much didn't have much of a choice in the end, right?
Yeah. So eventually it came back, and we discussed it and different things. But fortunately, I had this background of fortunately, I had started off by reading Orchard-Hays' book, so that I had some idea what I should really expect to find in Minos instead of the sort of things that were taught in elementary courses.
How did you do literature review back then?
So you went to there was a math library and a computer science library. I think they were merged at some point, and you could get a key to it if you were a graduate student. So you let yourself in, and basically I started the journals from A and worked my way to Z. And when I found a journal that looked like it would have something of interest, I would go back to, 1945 or whatever, and start looking through the table of contents to find things. And of course, anytime I found something, then it would have references, and I could follow those back to other things. But that was really that was the literature review. You actually had to go and look for the literature, and you couldn't search for anything any other way. But I found a lot of interesting papers that explained what was going on and what people had tried and so forth. And that was those days. That was the thing these days. You really needed articles to be published, because that was the only way that they could actually put on paper and sent around to people, and that you could find them.
Yeah, I can imagine. Bob, I have this curiosity. How was the reaction from the folks at Stanford when Khachiyan proved that linear programming was polynomially solvable?
Well, I guess there was a little of sort of, well, is this really significant? Will this really work and so forth? Because, uh, but, uh, but it was also the people at Stanford who like got his paper translated and wrote something up that actually described what was happening in it, and that went around.
Mm-hmm.
And this would have been around my last year there. I mean, since it was computational complexity, there was a lot of interest in computer science as well. So it wasn't just OR people saying, we already know how to do this. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a fair amount of excitement. Although I think the method actually described by Khachiyan didn't really turn out to be of any great significance. But it got people thinking about like doing other things in a polynomial way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was mostly about a complexity result, I would say.
Yeah.
Do you remember George Dantzig's reaction?
No, not specifically. But I imagine, I mean, he was always interested in new things. So
you finished your PhD in 1979 and you joined Northwestern University in that same year. Yeah. It seems that you were interviewed by another Bob Bixby.
Yeah. Yes.
When applying for the job, right?
Yes, that's right. So I know he had come there only a few years before. I had actually interviewed somewhere else the day before, so I got there and I talked to the usual, gave my talk. I interviewed with all the different faculty members, and then we went out to dinner. So Bob and someone else took me out to dinner, and there he asked me a lot of questions about what was it that I was really doing, because actually my interests at that point were very different from his and from the kind of research he had done. But since I had a math background, it wasn't like I couldn't see how interesting his work was. So, but that was how I met him. Actually, was he interviewed me there.
He was into matroids and things like that, and you were into simplex algorithm.
Yeah, that's right.
Uh-huh. Bob Bixby mentioned that you guys did a consultancy work together in the early 80s.
Yeah, that's right. It was his contact, really, somebody at Exxon in New Jersey. And we actually went there for, I don't know, a month or something. And we had been working on a project to like detect embedded networks in optimization problems. And there was a lot of interesting theory around that. And so we were trying to actually implement some ideas, maybe some heuristics that would get good results for that. Because if you knew the embedded network, maybe you could solve the problem better. And even though it wasn't entirely a network flow problem. And so we went there and worked on that and gave a few talks about other things we were interested in. His connection there was actually, that was the genesis of simplex, was through work he did for them. But that only started after he had moved to Rice University. So that didn't directly affect me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I interviewed him last year, Bob also told me that you seem to suffer from a severe migraine. How is it these days?
Oh, yeah, no, there are much better medicines for that now, very migraine-specific ones. So I don't have the same level of problem that I used to.
Uh-huh. I asked you earlier about the reaction to Khachiyan's paper. But I would like to know, how did you react when you heard the news of Karmarkar's algorithm?
Yes. So, I mean, originally we thought, well, this was another polynomial time algorithm, right? Mm-hmm. And it was also sort of, moving through the interior and but the difference was that Khachiyan at the time that his came out was still in the Soviet Union. And there was very limited contact with him. And it was mostly other people in other countries seeing what they could do with his ideas, whereas Karmarkar was a graduate student at Berkeley and then a scientist at Bell Laboratories, and he could go to conferences and talk about his work. And I remember one particularly where he said he opened it by saying, "Welcome to the new era in linear programming." So you see that there was a whole different flavor to it. This idea of people actually telling you, no, you've been doing it wrong, and this is going to be much, much better. And of course, you hear this periodically, always, and sometimes it's truer than other times, but sometimes it's true. So that gave a whole different flavor to it. And
what did you think when you heard that claim? Did it seem to you like a false bravado or something like that?
No, I knew what he was saying was that this method would solve problems much faster linear programs, continuous linear programs, much faster. And if indeed it panned out that that's what it did, then if you wanted to solve linear programs, this really would be a new era. Like it might eclipse the old methods because it would solve things, 10, 100 times faster. So I knew why he was saying that and what he was hoping would happen. I mean, the way things actually turned out was somewhat different, but it wasn't a lot different from somebody saying today that they're going to solve linear programs on a GPU and it's going to revolutionize solve it 100 times faster. I mean, so I think it was sort of natural
Uh-huh.
to claim this. I mean, there are always big new discoveries and someone has to champion them.
Yeah, that's right. Bob, one of your most significant research contributions involves extending the simplex method to handle convex separable piecewise linear functions. Could you provide more detail on this?
I think that was the first linear program thing that I did that was not part of my thesis and was all done at Northwestern. And but I have to say that what I found was that it's impossible to do anything new with the simplex method, in the sense that whatever you do, it'll turn out that somebody had a similar idea in this paper back in such and such, and this one, and this person sort of did it but got it wrong. But this person, it was in a different country or a different language or something. So I ended up finding lots of people who had done separable piecewise linear simplex methods. And the key is not to write the first paper on it because somebody's going to tell you it's not the first one, but to write the last paper on it. and so I really tried to do the theory of it right and to show what the applications of it would be. It turned out, although it wasn't really in my papers, that probably the biggest application is that, as was well known, if you add bounds to the variables of a linear program, then to the dual problem, you're adding piecewise linear terms. And so a lot of the ideas from general piecewise linear optimization apply to the dual simplex method, which is the method of choice for a lot of things these days. And so that turns out to be an important idea to speed that up.
Right. Did any of your contributions in that regard end up in the solvers?
Yeah, I think in the Gurobi solver, there's a piecewise linear, and in one other solver too that was done earlier, much earlier, had that in it. I wrote a paper, a joint paper, like testing it out and showing that it in fact worked quickly. And then I was told that they had implemented it some when they put piecewise linear formulations in the Gurobi, they put something to solve the convex case. That's the general thing. Like I say, it's for the dual simplex that the ideas mostly show up, and those are only two piecewise linear terms.
That must feel great, right? To have your ideas being embraced by the solvers. And
Mm-hmm.
Regarding your work on indefinite linear systems arising in interior point methods, what made you shift from simplex to interior point methods?
Oh, there were lots of people working on interior point methods around then, and really so Karmarkar had proposed this, but it was other people at Bell Labs who got the idea, who really said, well, if you think about it like this, then you can really see what's going on. And I don't know, it may not have a polynomial time provable bound, but it's something that looks really practical. So I was talking to people like Bob Vanderby at Bell Labs and Sanjay Mehrotra at Northwestern who were coming up with great ideas for making this work better. And this particular paper with Sanjay came out of talks with those people, and the idea, well, maybe instead of collapsing this big linear system to a smaller one that was relatively easy to solve, sometimes it's better to solve the bigger one, even though it's harder. So that's how I got into it. I mean, I was just interested in computation, and I knew some people were really doing really great things, so I got involved somewhat.
Right. Could you talk a bit about the news server and your involvement in its development?
So there was a lunch with the head of the sort of math science group or an optimization group at Argonne National Laboratory, which is in the Chicago suburbs, so not so far from Northwestern. And a bunch of us from Northwestern were there, and the head of this was there, and a few other people, and we got to thinking, well, what's a good project? And we came up with this idea of sort of making optimization more of a internet resource. because the internet was really new then. And so like the idea was, instead of having to go get some software and install it somewhere, there was somewhere you could just submit problems. And that was the genesis of the NEOS project. And now it happens I was off on sabbatical the next year, so I didn't originally have that much influence on it the first year they were doing it. But when I came back, that'll get us on to the next topic, which I guess is AMPL, because then we said the thing was that the easy ways to actually submit problems were not available yet. And so I got involved in that, and I ended up being involved in developments of various kinds with it over the next, I don't know, 6 or 8 years, and wrote a couple grant proposals to get money to support it and so forth. So I ended up being quite involved with NEOS. I was involved at the beginning, and then I ended up being involved later.
Mm-hmm. That all happened mostly during the 90s, correct?
Let's see. Yeah, it would have started around mid-90s, 95 probably. It started there. And so we ended up getting all the great solvers are in NEOS, and anybody can go try them. It still gets used quite a bit.
Yeah, that's great. Bob, now let's finally talk about AMPL. Your paper, titled Modeling Languages versus Matrix Generators for Linear Programming, which essentially proposed the main idea behind AMPL, was published in 1983 in ACM Transactions on Mathematical Software, but it was originally rejected in Operations Research, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, going back a bit, so I mentioned before that I had this colleague named Michael Harrison at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and we wrote a paper. It was called something like A Modern Approach to Systems for Mathematical Programming, where we describe what we thought, based on our observations of the Orchard-Hays system, we thought that there was something that would be a lot more useful. And we described the various ways in which it could be more useful. We wrote this technical report, and it sort of got finished while I was a graduate student. And after I landed at Northwestern, I did a little revising of it and sent it off to this journal, not knowing much about these journals. And but I don't know, the linear programming experts they sent me to were people who had done things the way they were currently done for a long time. So they looked at it and said, "Well, this is not possible. How can you possibly write a modeling language like this? And what's this about viewing on the screen what the progress is? Like the lines will just fly off the top of the screen or something." And like they had never heard of a scrolling window, and so they were not very receptive to this. And of course, I mean, our paper was basically saying, "Oh, we know how to do everything better." And so maybe that was not like a good way to write it if you want people to accept it, right? But one person helpfully told me, said to me, maybe you should send it to the ACM Transactions on Mathematical Software, because that's a more specialized journal for this sort of thing. And fortunately for me, one of the editors there was also at the NBER when I was there. So I had somebody who's sort of sympathetic to this kind of thing. He had also worked on computational math programming and was not so surprised by these ideas. And but the other thing was that I realized after sending this in that I was assuming much too much about what people believed about linear programming systems, and that I really need to go back and start at a more basic level as to why you should even want a modeling language. I thought it was pretty obvious. Well, this would be neat to have, right? But so the idea was to write something that gave the principles, not just here's a great idea, but why is it that inherently this will be better? It's not just that it'll be better because I implement it better, but it will be better because it has some inherent advantages over writing a program to generate your linear program, which is basically the matrix generator approach. And so I wrote sort of a different paper, although using some of the same ideas, but also backing it up. And I also, like I said, there's nothing new in linear programming. So I went back and found all these examples of people who had done modeling languages before. So I can't claim to have invented the idea of a modeling language. Even the GAMS language, in fact, existed at the time that I wrote this paper. But my idea was to explain why it's not just that people wrote these things and they're nice to use, but in fact, they have this inherent advantage and you should expect to need to use them. And of course, today people sort of take them for granted, but that's the the background of it. And so that paper, in fact, went through 2 rounds of reviewing. And at some point, both of the referees rejected it, but they never rejected it at the same time. It's like one objected strongly to it the first submission, but then when I revised it, said, okay, I guess this is all right. And the second one seemed to think it was all right, but then after I revised it, had a change of heart. But like I said, the editor, however, recommended that it be accepted, and then went up to the editor-in-chief, and the editor-in-chief was convinced to publish it. And so I managed to get it out there. And doesn't seem so radical today, but I think anybody who's had an academic job that involves publishing a lot of papers will tell you 10 stories like this if you get them started.
Yeah, but this was a very important paper. I feel that you had to educate the community for them to properly appreciate your contribution. Yeah. So in your head, it was all clear, but yeah. I understand that it's hard to claim that you're proposing something really original. As you said, modeling languages were already there, but you took things to another level, I would say. Yeah. And maybe the community was not really prepared to digest all of that, and that required you to go back and explain and make them be convinced that this was a great idea, right?
Yeah.
When and where AMPL started to be developed for good?
So another person I knew from NBER, the research center, was David Gay, who was a postdoctoral fellow there and at MIT. And his background was numerical analysis, so he was interested in all kinds of optimization things. And by the time I had been at Northwestern for 5-6 years and was at a point where I could do a sabbatical, I'd run into him a couple of times at conferences. And in particular, during my 6th year, I ran into him and said, well, I'm going to be doing a sabbatical next year. And he said, well, we can arrange sabbaticals here. And so it turns out that it's a great kind of sabbatical in the Computing Science Research Center at Bell Labs, and that they don't really have any visiting professors. So all they can do is to put you on the payroll for a year as a member of technical staff. And then you can, since it's a research center, you don't have to find some projects that are funded in any sense. You just have to do something that people are convinced would be really useful for the company. And it turned out that implementing languages was something they knew a lot about. And they had done all sorts of languages for different purposes, besides programming languages like C and C++ and the scripting language for Unix and so forth. They had done all sorts of specialized languages, typesetting and things like this. So when I mentioned this thing, it was like, oh yeah, we can do that. We should see, and they came up with a language that I probably wouldn't have invented on my own. And but together, given that we had me and we had David Gay and we had Brian Kernighan, who was known for a number of these little languages, and we each had different perspective, which was really great. And so we each contributed a different thing to putting the AMPL together.
Wow. Who coded the first versions of AMPL?
So Brian coded the first version, and the idea was to get something going that would do linear programs really fast, using whatever tricks were available. I mean, if you could write out a file and sort it, and that would get something from row-wise to column-wise, well, you would just do that kind of thing. Uh-huh. So by the time I left after a year to go back to Northwestern, we had something that would actually run. And
in C++, correct?
Yeah. So so of course Brian's famous for writing the C book,
mm-hmm.
but the new house language when I was there was C++, and so he thought, well, it would be good to write it in that because he should get to know some C++ better. And besides, it was like more advanced and would serve our purposes better. So it's always been written in a kind of C++, although not as fully object oriented as probably people would write things today. Then after I left, Dave Gay took over this thing and wrote we needed a version that would handle nonlinear problems and a lot of things. It turns out that it wasn't such a little language after all. So he wrote version 2, which became the standard version of it, and which is not a bad way to do things, really.
So So Brian Kernighan, for the viewers and listeners who are not familiar with his name, he's not only known for writing that famous C book, he's also known to have coined the term Unix, and also he's one of the authors of the famous Lin-Kernighan heuristic for the TSP. So, I mean, the chance of working with such a legend like him for you, it should have been also really motivating, right?
Right. Yeah. So it was a great place to work. I mean, since you're a member of technical staff like anybody else, we pretty much were taken care of as far as resources, and so you could concentrate on doing something.
So you had a lot of fun at Bell Laboratories.
Yeah. Karmarkar was there at the time too. I gave a little tutorial on linear programming so people could understand Karmarkar's presentation of his method.
Did you get to meet him there and have a word with him?
Yeah. So he was in the math center, I think, but the math center and the computer science center were pretty close. I mean, people often collaborate between them.
Yeah, I think at that time he was working with Mauricio Rezende and other guys on coding the first workable version of the interior point algorithm.
Yeah.
Did you code anything?
There, I must say I did solver interfaces. At times at Bell Labs, because I mean Dave was doing the basic AMPL code, and but you had to write a separate program to take the output from AMPL and convert it into what the solver needed. And at one point, I think it was my second visit to Bell Labs, I did one for a constraint programming solver that needed actually C++ calls and it was like a C++ library, and so that was a real challenge to take the AMPL output and put it in this completely different form. So I did some programming, but I was never programmed any of these really big things. I didn't program.
Sure. And who had the idea of the Black Panther?
Oh, that's the book. So the publisher of the book chose that. They had this idea they were going to do a series of OR software things, and each one of them would have a different animal on the cover. And so it was really their idea. But since everybody who was using AMPL at the time would see this book, right, it became naturally just our logo as well for the software.
Yeah, I was watching this interview with Brian Kernighan, and he told that this book was not written using LaTeX, correct?
Right, because it was using TROF, which was an earlier typesetting system, which was still in use at Bell Labs. There's this tendency that, like, in any organization, once you find a really great thing, you tend to stick with it. I mean, they were doing typesetting before anybody else practically, because they had this great TROF system. Because by the time I got there, it was being overtaken by tech and LaTeX, right? But everybody there knew how to use it, and they could make it do everything they wanted. And Brian actually, at some point, was responsible for the code, and so it didn't make sense to like switch to LaTeX just to do this book when they knew how to do it already. So that's why it was done in a completely different language. And
yes, it appears that you guys struggled to take AMPL out of Bell Labs, right?
Yeah, so of course there was this revolution in telecommunications, which resulted in AT&T sort of splitting apart, and Bell Labs becoming not so important because it was no longer supported by this huge monopoly. So in the midst of all this, I mean, the people involved with it, Dave and Brian, left Bell Labs, but the people who were still there were very nervous. I mean, it was not clear what was going to happen. I think basically AMPL became part of Lucent Technologies, which was spun off of AT&T and was supposed to be sort of the equipment part of it. And so like nobody really wanted to make any decisions, because what if they were wrong? Because I mean, when things are going well, no one worries about this, but when things are tough, it's another matter. So it took us a number of years after Dave left, and it took him a while to convince them, like to actually even sign an agreement. And then it took us longer to convince them that they should like scrap the agreement and just give us the rights in exchange for some money. And probably took over 5 years. It's quite a bit of time before we finally got the full rights to it from Bell Laboratories, or from Lucent Technologies. And Lucent Technologies eventually disappeared. It got merged into something, which got merged into something else. So it was a good thing we got it. And,
well, it should have been a struggle, really, to go through all of that. I think you guys had a lot of patience
Oh, wait.
to keep the project alive and take out of
Yeah.
Bell Labs.
Right.
And the Apple company was finally founded in 2003. Who was using the software until then?
Just a few people, a few academics for things or for teaching a course or two, and maybe some people within AT&T who are using it for production problems. So we had a number of early users who were trying it out, but at that point you couldn't really buy it because like the AT&T and its successors were not really set up to sell things, and in fact, to some degree, because they were a legal monopoly, they couldn't sell things. Right? I mean, the idea was they shouldn't take their monopoly in phone service and use it to subsidize selling other stuff. It would give them an unfair advantage. So that made it hard. So it wasn't until we could like form a company and get a contract saying we were a distributor of it that we were actually could say, okay, now we can sell it. So before that, it was just people testing it out, like early users who were interested in it, so forth.
How many people are currently working for the company?
Oh, a dozen more or less, I would say. It might be as high as 14. There are some like interns and such that come and go, so I don't know what is the exact number.
Do you guys have an office or it's mostly remote work?
No, we don't have an office, and we never had an office because Dave was in New Jersey and I was in Illinois, so we didn't have any obvious place to have an office. And so when we hired more people, they were in California because that's where they happened to be. And so then it just, for a while, I thought, well, we'd try to keep everyone in the United States, but then it turned out if you wanted the best software developers, they were just wherever you found them, and you can't just insist that someone change countries. So we ended up being completely distributed and having people in many time zones. And at the time, this seemed like a bit of a stretch. Like, were people really going to be willing to work for a place that didn't have an office? But of course, we know what happened, and now it's considered to be sort of normal.
Yeah, absolutely. How many customers do you have?
So I don't know. I don't have a real count, and sometimes it's hard to tell how someone will buy it, and then like we won't know. We don't always hear from them, and maybe they're using it and they're just not requesting any maintenance service, and we don't know. But I think it's a couple hundred. The number of used it at one time or another is greater, but sometimes somebody uses it for a project, and eventually that project comes to an end, and so like you have like former users as well.
Mm-hmm. Bob, with things changing really rapidly, especially when you think about software APIs and all of these things, how do you guys keep up to date with the solver interface?
So, I mean, it's a constant job because solvers keep coming out with new versions. You have to, every time there's a new version, you have to do a revision. And in recent years, solvers have begun, everyone started thinking more like a modeling language, and so they're thinking in terms of, well, what new forms can we use for input that will be more like what the modeler wants? Or some of them have actually developed their own modeling language to go with their particular solver, and they maybe built it in Python and this and that. And so we have to keep up with what they're doing. If they specially recognize some kind of constraint, then we should be able to recognize it too, and take advantage of that. So what finally happened was that they got enough of these new sort of things that I mean, over the years, all these different ideas accumulated in the solver interface, and it was powerful up to a point, but it became hard to keep generalizing it. So eventually someone working for us, Gleb Bailov, and it was actually in Melbourne, Australia, had done this sort of thing before. And initially as a academic project and later as a regular project, he rewrote the entire interface for a lot of these solvers. And so for a lot of solvers now, we have a different thing that can handle a lot more sorts of conversions and recognize more kinds of problems and figure out how to send them to solvers. I mean, that's been sort of the history of modeling languages. The whole idea of it is it should be better. It should enable you to tell the system what you think your problem is, and then it should figure out how to send it to whatever solver you want. And you shouldn't have to think about what the solver wants. And that's never been like totally achieved, but we've gotten closer and closer to it.
Yeah. And how about the generic callbacks? I wonder, how do you guys find your way to accommodate all of those things?
Yeah, that's part of this idea that we would have a closer connection to the solver. typically, AMPL sends something to the interface, and the interface sends it to the solver. But what if you want to talk to the solver while it's running? Our initial setup was that you send it to the solver and you wait for it to come back until you had finished. So a different setup in Python and C++ was worked out that enabled people to call to talk to the solver. And one big part of that is to get callbacks from the solver at various points and to do something with them. But then there are lots of solvers. So the idea was that every solver has its own idea of callbacks, but there are certain common things. So we made there are some callbacks that are generic in the sense that you can write this code and it will work with many solvers. And then there are other callbacks only work with a particular solver, since that's the only one that does that particular thing. But, we have to add all these great things. But at the same time, by now we have some really long-term users. I mean, I said before, well, some people use it and then they stop, but there are people, a lot of people who use it really keep using it for quite a long time, and it becomes a really important part of their activities. They don't want you to change it to the point that like only this old version will work for them because you've messed up something they need in the new version. So you're always weighing like backwards compatibility for the people who've really successfully using it and put it into practice, and new features that you want to recommend to new users or to users who are starting a new optimization project in some company that's been using it for a while. That's an extra complication of, I think, keeping the software product like this relevant.
Yes, absolutely. Do you believe there's any room for innovation in terms of modeling languages?
So, well, I think it gets back a lot to the idea that the modeling language should be your way of expressing your problem yourself to the solver. And we've made a lot of progress on that, but there's always more to do. So I think by no means have we got the perfect thing where you can just describe it in this very general way, and not just by equations, but by saying, well, either this condition holds or this one, and put in all sorts of functions that are not really either linear or smooth nonlinear, and put all this together, and still it'll do it. And we can do much better than we used to, but I think there's always room to improve on that. Other big thing is just to keep up with computing. So computing is always changing. So, when we started, there was no such thing as Python. So all of a sudden Python explodes, and now we have to think, well, what's it mean to use AMPL in a Python notebook? And which we had never thought of before, right? And so there are constantly new ideas in computing that come up, and if you've got some software package that does something, you have to take into account all these new ideas. I mean, the same goes with where you run it. People much more often now run problems in the cloud somewhere or in a container or something like that. I mean, modeling languages have to keep up with that. They can't just run on your local computer anymore, and they can make a difference. Or another thing I mentioned was GPUs, and so now people are starting to propose software that runs on GPUs and can solve at least continuous linear programs really fast, right? By using new ideas. And well, that's going to change the mode in which people operate. Maybe it means that they're going to want to solve lots of similar problems one after another because they can solve them so fast, or they're going to do something different, some different mode of use. And now you're going to have to adjust to that and make sure that you support it.
Yeah, a lot of work for sure ahead. Yeah. Bob, there has been a considerable progress regarding generative AI, large language models, machine learning, and so on. How do you see the future of mathematical optimization tools in this context, especially when it comes to writing and implementing mathematical models?
So I think writing mathematical models is pretty much straightforward, what people expect to do with chatbots. I mean, they can write mathematical models too. And actually they can write not only the models, but eventually you have to embed those models in software that creates applications, and they can write that for you as well. And our experiments show that they already sort of know how to do this. Right from when ChatGPT took off and all these other ones appeared, they miraculously knew how to write AMPL, for example, because they were trained on all this stuff, and there were AMPL sites with AMPL models. So that's one way, perhaps more revolutionary way that they're going to affect things. It has to do with just building sort of systems, sort of what people call learning optimization problems. So the idea is you have some input, and you have basically any optimization model takes some input and produces some output. So why not use some traditional optimization model to solve with a whole bunch of different inputs. And then now you've got inputs and outputs, and then you use those to train like a neural network of some kind. And now the neural network is much faster than the optimization algorithm, and it gives very near to optimal results, you hope. So now you can use that to like get results very quickly. So if you've got some application where you need to get quick results a lot of times, then this is a way to do it. That's an example of the kinds of things people are doing to try to revolutionize optimization in ways like that. And so there's a question of, well, where does the modeling fit into all of that? And I think that's going to be a big topic.
So I think one of the barriers when it comes to mathematical optimization tools compared to, let's say, AI and machine learning software, it's because we have to come up with a model. And sometimes people, they might struggle, they might not have the skills. Whereas when you do applications with AI and machine learning tools, you basically need data, and it's not that hard to get an outcome, depending on application, of course.
Yeah.
So the idea of using generative AI can sort of change the mindset when constructing models, in the sense of, I would not say that's exactly try and error, but you can, build something and then try to work out and adapt from that instead of developing yourself from scratch, especially when you speak about inexperienced optimizers.
Yeah.
Do you agree with this? Do you have any comments?
Yeah. I think that's actually a programmers in general are finding this, that now you can consider building something by asking a series of questions to a chatbot, and it'll build some sort of system for you. And then once you get used to it, the sort of questions to ask and what to do to fix things of theirs. And then at the end, you still have to know how to fix it up so that it works. Typically, like you're using the API for some system that you're using to, build an application or send the problem to a solver or something. And the traditional way to do it is that you study the documentation and you keep looking back and finding all these different function calls you need or different methods and so forth. But with the generative AI approach, essentially the generative AI system has already learned all the documentation. So instead of wasting your time looking for these things in this whole list of different methods and so forth, you can say, well, I want to do this. And it'll say, well, you should write it like this, and get pretty close. And now at least you know pretty much what to look at, and maybe you need to adjust it a bit. But it makes a much faster learning curve, because it directs you to the parts of the API that you really need to know. And that's the way people write a lot of things. The way you write a solver interface is you find somebody else's solver interface, and you look at that and say, well, now how do I have to modify it, right? And this is similar. Well, the way you write something is that you ask the generative AI system to write something, and it's not quite right, but you can start from that instead of starting from a blank sheet paper or a blank screen,
Yeah. Bob, now let's change topics. You got married for the first time only 15 years ago, which is rather unusual, I would say. How did you meet your wife?
We're both Stanford graduates. So we met at some Stanford, Chicago. Actually, it was a film group. We would just meet to discuss some movie occasionally. And so my wife's background is quite different. Her father was from Spain and her mother's from Mexico, but she was born in San Francisco. So she grew up speaking Spanish at home, but English at school. And eventually she went to Stanford and studied Spanish language and literature, and got a PhD in that. So she also has a PhD from Stanford, but a very different one. And so that's how we came to meet, through like local Stanford alumni events. But I have to say that she also had never been married. So I said maybe not that rare.
No, yeah. At least among the OR people that I have interviewed, I think you're the person who got married in a, let's say, later stage of your life, relatively speaking. Do you have any regrets?
Well, everybody who's sort of doing research has regrets that, well, you didn't follow up this. There are collaborations I could have followed up that I didn't, I probably maybe owe some apologies to people that I did some work, but I should have worked with them on something too, and that kind of thing. Or that maybe I should have worked more with my advisor, George Dantzig, than I did, that kind of stuff. Or that I wrote this paper, but there was another good idea I should have had that I didn't mention it, I would have gotten more credit if I had put that in there, that kind of thing. And I think that's pretty common. Like your sort of career doesn't go so smoothly that like you do everything possible.
Uh-huh. Any final remarks to our viewers and listeners?
So related to that, I'd say that a lot depends on chance, has been my experience. It's like I said, I ended up as editor-in-chief of the campus newspaper because I ran into this friend of mine who used to work on it while we were crossing the street in different directions. And I've had a lot of experiences like that where I ran into somebody and something got started and it just happened to lead to something new. And also, I think your whole career tends to be that way. Like whether a certain job worked out or it didn't work out, whether you got this grant or you didn't get it, it's sort of determined entirely. After the fact, it seems determined. And you look back and you said, of course, this person did this great work with this, right? But it's actually at the time you can't tell. It's sort of so my sort of advice is in general to keep trying and be open to things, because some things won't work out, but some things will. And you just don't know which are going to be which until you've tried for a while.
Yeah. Like quoting a George Harrison song, sometimes are good, sometimes are bad. That's all part of life.
Yeah.
So I think your message is great, and it summarizes a lot of your story. Yeah. And I myself can relate to that because I ran into you in Santiago by chance.
Yeah.
I went there to your session to see the work by a friend of mine. And then I got the chance to meet you and invite you to be part of the podcast. So I think it resonates to what you just said.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Bob, thank you so much for your time. You are one of the great personalities of our field, and it has been a great honor. And I had a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I thank you too for inviting me and for setting this all up. I thought it was really impressive.
Yeah. So if you're coming again to South America, don't hesitate to contact me. Maybe we can meet again in person.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So, well, Bob, thanks again. I hope you stay really healthy. Take care, and see you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Ciao.